Subcommittee on Space will come to order, please. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Deep Space Exploration, Examining the Impact of the President's Budget. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Last week was an amazing time for the space community. A major Hollywood film about the exploration of Mars debuted within days of NASA announcing a significant scientific discovery, liquid water on Mars. The coincidence of these two events garnered the public's attention, and rightly so. Rarely does popular culture and science align in such a serendipitous fashion. The attention also prompted obvious questions from the public, such as, how will discovering water on Mars impact future exploration? Are we really going to Mars? And how and when are we going to get there? These are all questions that the general public may not have the answers to, but thankfully, NASA does. Because of bipartisan direction and investments made by Congress, we are well on our way to Mars. We're building the most powerful rocket ever built, the Space Launch System, so we can launch large payloads to beyond Earth orbit with decreased risk to overall missions. We're building the Orion crew capsule so that our astronauts can travel farther into deep space than ever before. And we're upgrading our ground systems to support 21st century operations. NASA has already tested the RS-25 engines and 5 segment boosters that will power the SLS. They've already launched an uncrewed version of Orion. And the Kennedy Space Center is undergoing revolutionary upgrades. But there is much more that needs to be done if the United States plans on launching a mission to Mars. We need to build a habitat module, advanced in-space propulsion, and a lander and ascent vehicle, just to name a few components. Fortunately, we don't have to develop all these capabilities at once. We can develop them incrementally over time. There are also potential opportunities for international and commercial partnerships that could be leveraged as well. The first step on the journey to Mars, however, begins with the development of SLS, Orion, and the related ground systems. Unfortunately, Congress's support has not been matched by the administration. In 2010, the President signed the NASA Authorization Act of 2010 into law, thereby directing NASA to develop the SLS and Orion systems. This piece of legislation was the product of a democratically controlled House and Senate that passed with 185 Democrats and 119 Republicans, demonstrating overwhelming bipartisanship. These programs are critical for the journey to Mars, and yet since 2010, the administration has attempted to cut their funding each and every year. This year alone, the President's budget request contains a cut of $343.5 million for SLS and a cut of $104 million for Orion. All told, the President's budget has requested nearly $500 million in cuts to these programs this fiscal year. This committee's NASA Authorization Act for 2016 and 2017 fully rejects these proposed cuts. And both the House and Senate Appropriations Committees have approved bills to do the same. Even though Congress consistently rejects the administration's proposed cuts year after year, the proposed cuts still have a negative effect on the programs. The annual budget uncertainty that the administration perpetuates impairs NASA's ability to manage the program efficiently on behalf of the taxpayer. At the same time that the administration has been strangling these programs, the NASA workforce has been diligently trying to keep the programs moving by setting up alternative cost and schedule commitments called management agreements. The agreements are separate from the official commitments in the KDPC. While it is promising that NASA is trying to make the best out of a poor situation, having multiple plans could potentially lead to confusion and inefficiencies. Fortunately, SLS and Orion have been successful in spite of the external challenges placed on the programs. This is largely thanks to the supremely professional workforce at NASA and the contractors. To all the hardworking men and women who are advancing the development of these programs, please know that your hard work is very much appreciated. Your work on these programs will inspire the next generation of explorers, maintain U.S. leadership globally, and chart new courses for humanity. Thank you for all that you do. You are the best that this nation has to offer. My hope is that folks across the administration will reverse course and begin to support the SLS and Orion programs and the workforce that makes them possible with the funding necessary to continue their success. SLS and Orion are crucial for deep space exploration and the first steps to Mars. We have two steely-eyed missile men before us today who are directly involved in the management of the human exploration program while they were at NASA. I look forward to hearing about how we can all ensure the success of our nation's human exploration program. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Maryland, for an opening statement.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to welcome back our two witnesses, Mr. Dumbacher and Mr. Cook, today. And I say back because both of you have appeared before our subcommittee previously as former leaders of NASA's human exploration programs. I appreciate your past public service as well as your willingness to testify here today. Mr. Chairman, last December, millions of people in America and around the world tasted the future when NASA conducted the Exploration Flight Test, EFT-1, in which the Orion crew vehicle traveled farther into space than any human spaceflight vehicle since the Apollo era. That future is an exciting one that includes sending humans to the surface of Mars. And Mars is the goal that we established in our bipartisan House-passed, overwhelmingly House-passed NASA Authorization Act of 2015. We sent it over to the Senate. And it's the consensus goal for human space exploration of a distinguished National Academies panel that recently examined U.S. human space exploration. So it's quite fitting, Mr. Chairman, that we follow up on our subcommittee's review of the Space Launch System and Orion crew vehicle programs that was held last December, just after the EFT-1 flight test, and see where these programs stand now. By any measure, the progress on SLS and Orion is visible and tangible. NASA and its contractors deserve credit for the many accomplishments achieved to date. Tests of the SLS solid rocket booster engines and the RS-25 main engine are reviving and modernizing the propulsion activities that brought us through the successful shuttle era. Elements of the Orion crew vehicle that will return American astronauts to deep space are being fabricated even as I speak. And just a few weeks ago, the Orion program was approved to transition from formulation into development, a major milestone known as Key Decision Point C, or KDPC. This hearing should provide an opportunity to discuss the outcomes of the Orion KDPC review and clarify any questions, including the perception by some of a 2-year, quote, slip to the first crewed flight test known as Exploration Mission 2, or EM2. However, I would note that the members of the panel were actually not involved in the recent Orion KDPC review. Only NASA can address questions regarding the KDPC, I can't even say that, KDPC milestone, discuss the breadth of accomplishments achieved to date, and inform us of the challenges going forward. Only NASA can do that. That's why, Mr. Chairman, I'm actually quite puzzled that NASA was not initially invited to testify, and why I extended an invitation to the Associate Administrator of NASA's Human Exploration and Operations Missions Directorate to serve as a witness. Unfortunately, the Associate Administrator's international travel schedule precluded his ability to appear this morning. So I hope, Mr. Chairman, that we'll give NASA the opportunity in another hearing to provide the details on the SLS and Orion programs that this subcommittee needs to hear. The fact is that ensuring that SLS and Orion make maximum progress, especially in this environment of budgetary uncertainty, is a job for both the administration and for Congress. And just as a side note, I would say that the budget caps known as the sequester give rise to the inability for us to get a multi-year bipartisan authorization and appropriation to the President's desk as the evidence of our support for SLS and Orion and for the journey to Mars. We have to lift those budget caps in order to accomplish the goals that we've set out for the agency and for its contractors. Ensuring that SLS and Orion make maximum progress, especially in this environment of budget uncertainty, is a job both for the administration and for Congress. And as the National Academy's report reminds us, achieving the goals for sending humans to deep space requires a joint commitment on the part of Congress and on the part of the administration. Mars is truly a goal that's worthy of this great nation, and I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, to enable NASA's continued progress toward that goal. And before I yield, I want to welcome an intern for a month in my office, Salil Maddy, who is at the Madeira School. We share interns with them every year, and two of them here today are very interested in space, and so we welcome them. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At a fundamental level, space exploration, the mission of NASA, is about inspiration. This inspiration fuels our desire to push the boundaries of what is possible and to reach beyond our own planet. The American people are fascinated with space exploration. Just last week, the discovery that water sometimes flows on Mars' surface made headlines across the world. And the latest space film, The Martian, has sparked questions about when NASA will send astronauts to Mars. Today's hearing seeks to answer those questions and examine the effect of the President's budget on our exploration programs. In its fiscal year 2016 budget proposal, the Obama administration proposed a cut of over $440 million from the programs that will take us to Mars, the Space Launch System and Orion Crew Vehicle. This isn't new. The President has tried to cut SLS and Orion every year since he took office. But there should be no misunderstanding. There is bipartisan support within Congress for SLS and the Orion Crew Vehicle. This committee restored the proposed cuts in our authorization bill, and the House and Senate Appropriations Committees restored these funds and supported SLS and Orion at the levels necessary to keep their development on track. Yet the administration continues to try to strangle these programs. NASA recently announced that the first crewed mission for SLS and Orion was delayed by 2 years because the administration would not allow NASA to budget for the programs. The administration regularly cuts SLS and Orion, and Congress continues to restore its cuts. The budget instability caused by the administration makes it hard for NASA to plan and execute these critical programs. The fact that NASA can still maintain these earlier dates in the face of administration opposition is a testament to the ingenuity, resolve, and professionalism of the NASA workforce. The Obama administration cannot continue to claim that it prioritizes Mars exploration if it refuses to prioritize and support the programs that will get us there. The SLS and Orion programs represent what is most impressive about the American spirit, our desire to explore. The technologies that are developed for these programs exemplify our greatest breakthroughs and demonstrate American ingenuity. The Apollo program 50 years ago demonstrated that we could reach the moon. Orion and SLS will take us beyond that and rekindle the American spirit of discovery and advance humanity farther in space than ever before. Congress will continue to ensure that these national priorities receive the funding that they need to stay on schedule and on budget. Great nations do great things, and fortune favors the bold. The next several years will determine whether American astronauts will be the first to plant a flag on Mars. We want them to have arrived there on board an Orion Crew Vehicle propelled by the Space Launch System. Mr. Chairman, I also just want to comment on the recent handout that we've all seen by the administration called NASA's Journey to Mars. Regrettably, however, this proposal contains no budget, it contains no schedule, no deadlines. It's just some real pretty photographs and some nice words. That is not going to do it. That is not going to get us to Mars. This sounds good, but it's actually a journey to nowhere until we have that budget and we have the schedule and we have the deadlines. And I hope the administration will change its posture and decide in the future that it's actually going to support SLS and Orion and keep them on schedule, because their proposals to cut SLS and Orion every single year is not helping us achieve the great goals that most Americans want to achieve in space. Now I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentlewoman from Texas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning. Let me welcome our witnesses. I look forward to your testimony. In view of the uncertainties in today's schedule, I will be brief in my remarks so that we can have enough time to have a good discussion with our witnesses. This committee has long supported a strong human space flight exploration program for the nation. I'm excited about the prospect of America leading an international team to the surface of Mars not too many years from now. And I hope that our two witnesses who have significant previous experience in NASA's human exploration program will help us better understand the challenges NASA faces in realizing the goal. NASA has just released its updated Journey to Mars report, and I hope that we will invite NASA to come before this committee to discuss it. As Ms. Edwards has noted, NASA should really be at the table today for this hearing. Getting to Mars will be very challenging. We all know that. And we know that it will take adequate funding if we are to get there efficiently and safely. I have made no secret of my willingness to invest in NASA, and this committee has that authority. All we have to do is authorize it. In its human exploration, aeronautics, science, and technology programs, because it is an investment, not just spending, an investment that will pay long-lasting dividends to this nation, as it has in the past. But it's not just a question of more money. It's giving NASA more predictability as to when that money will actually show up. If this Congress is looking for reasons why NASA's exploration program faces potential delays, we need to look no further than ourselves right here on this committee. Too many times in recent years, NASA's had no idea when it would actually get an appropriation, when it would actually be reauthorized, whether that appropriations would be for more than a few months, or whether they may even have to suspend their work due to government shutdown. That is no way that a government should treat a premier program and a premier R&D enterprise as its dedicated workforce to have it to operate. If we are going to ask NASA and its contractors to carry out the extremely challenging job of getting America to Mars, this Congress is going to have to do its job as well. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back, and I wait to hear what you are going to authorize for this mission. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Let me introduce our witnesses now. First, we have Mr. Douglas Cook, who will be testifying, the owner of Cook Concepts and Solutions, and a former Associate Administrator of Exploration Systems at NASA. This division is responsible for building Orion and the SLS, the two vehicles that will take humans to deep space destinations, including Mars. Mr. Cook is the recipient of several awards, including the Presidential Distinguished Rank Award and Presidential Meritorious Rank Award. He has over 40 years of experience in human spaceflight. He received his bachelor's in aerospace engineering from Texas A&M University. And we're very happy to have him here today. Thank you, Mr. Cook. Our second witness today is Mr. Daniel Dumbacher. Mr. Dumbacher is a professor of engineering practice at Purdue University. Mr. Dumbacher served as Deputy Associate Administrator in the Exploration Systems Development Division at NASA. He has received the Presidential Rank Award for Meritorious Service and the NASA Exceptional Achievement Medal. Prior to his 35-year career with NASA, Mr. Dumbacher earned his bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Purdue University and a master's in business administration from the University of Alabama. He is also a graduate of the Senior Managers and Government Study Program at Harvard University. I now recognize Mr. Cook for 5 minutes to present his testimony. Mr. Cook, if you could start over and turn on your mic.
Apologize. I want to thank Chairman Babin, Ranking Member Edwards, and from the full committee, Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Johnson, and members of this committee for this opportunity. My interest in human exploration of space has been a primary focus of my life and career since the flights of Yuri Gagarin and the Mercury astronauts. The success of programs to send people to the Moon and Mars is of paramount importance to me, and I believe to everyone. I applaud your bipartisan support and the people at NASA and in industry who work diligently every day to make these and other NASA programs successful. The important questions you are asking specifically address deep space exploration, so that is the part of the budget I'll address. The most challenging aspect of managing these programs is due to constrained budgets and unplanned changes to operating budgets, whether real or contrived. The technical challenges are fun in comparison. The disparity between the President's budget request, or PBR, and budgets passed by Congress for exploration vehicles, the Space Launch System, Orion, and ground systems causes problems in managing and executing these programs. It also causes issues in perception of program health. To advance these programs, Congress has consistently passed budgets each year that are significantly greater than the PBR. It has been clear Congress intends to follow through with this necessary funding, yet the administration asks for less. NASA managers are required to plan the complex development schedules to the PBR over the 5-year runout. NASA fixed costs are included and are a higher percentage of a lower PBR budget. This leaves less money for SLS and Orion progress. Constrained budgets limit what work can be accomplished more efficiently in parallel. It moves stated flight dates later than if they planned a congressional budget runouts. Contracts are negotiated with companies for content and schedule. Flight dates and expectations are set. When there are major policy or priority shifts or disruptions to the budget process and funding, these detailed plans and their interdependencies have to be changed. Schedules and contracts are renegotiated at additional cost, adding to the problem. As an example, the 2016 President's request for SLS, Orion, and ground systems is $2.86 billion. Under current spending under the continuing resolution, NASA should be spending at a rate commensurate with the 2015 level of $3.25 billion, or $382 million more. In fact, the current 2015 spending level is $118 million more than the President's budget proposes for the year 2020 in their 5-year runout. On the other hand, for 2016 alone, this year's House bill is $546 million over the President's 2016 request, and the Senate's bill is $647 million more. If a budget bill is passed for NASA this year at these higher levels, the programs will adjust spending upward. Programs will make the most of these funds in advancing the programs, but changing rates creates inefficiencies. They will still plan to the budget's reduced level for 2017 and beyond. I do advocate for the higher levels. If the administration would propose at needed values within small percentage points of consistent congressional levels, spending rates would be much more stable and planning more reliable. I believe this disparity in policy priorities has remained since the cancellation of Constellation program. I was asked to comment on the use of the Joint Confidence Level, an analysis used in the KDPC milestones for SLS last year and the same milestone for Orion this year. These milestones led to NASA announcement of delays for SLS of 1 year and up to 2-year slip in the first crewed flight. Theoretically, the JCL is a good statistical analysis for evaluation of the uncertainties in programs that affect budget and schedule. An accurate JCL calculation requires meticulous collection of extremely detailed tasks, costs, and schedules, costing program milestones or resources. The JCL provides a valuable function in rigorous inspection of a program. However, from my direct experience in implementing it, I believe it has little utility for predicting schedule milestones in this budget environment when planning to the President's budget request rather than actual congressional appropriated budgets. JCL outcomes become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because actual budgets are higher year to year, NASA tries to maintain earlier planning dates and is trying to mitigate this confusion, but could be more efficient if the source of confusion were not there. There are significant differences in budget and oversight practices between the commercial cargo and crew and the traditional exploration programs. With the experience gained thus far, best practices should be established for both while preserving safety and accountability. SLS and Orion are first critical developments in our human exploration of the solar system. They are making great progress in spite of these burdens. I want to thank the committee and your staff again for your continued support of NASA and human spaceflight. I have submitted further detail in my written testimony and welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. We appreciate it. I now recognize Mr. Dumbacher for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Chairman Babin and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss NASA's deep space exploration efforts on this, the 31st anniversary of astronaut Kathy Sullivan's spacewalk. On this day in 1984, Dr. Sullivan, current NOAA administrator, became the first U.S. woman ever to see the Earth from that unique vantage point. I thank you also for your strong support of our nation's space exploration efforts. It is an honor for me to represent Purdue, a public land-grant university educating the next generation of explorers. I find the students of today to be part of a curious, passionate, and dedicated generation. These young voters are ready to build and create a better future for all of us. And as a former NASA team member, I want to express my utmost respect for the NASA industry team's accomplishments in the current environment. This team is working on a scale larger than Apollo with a constrained budget. Much like today's students, their enthusiasm and dedication to the mission is evident every day and sets the leadership example. The NASA 2010 Authorization Act and the 2014 Pathways to Exploration report from the National Research Council provide a sound, inclusive basis for space exploration goals and objectives that should be adequately funded. I believe we are at a critical juncture in our exploration efforts. As we continue missions to extend our presence further into the solar system, we must build the foundational capabilities for humans to go onward, the Space Launch System and Orion. We must effectively utilize humanity's principal technological achievement, the International Space Station, as an exploration testbed and valuable research facility, and we must seed the initial phases of commercial space travel. Given the budget instability and continuous policy debates, the NASA industry team is making great progress. The team is dedicated to building all systems as safely as possible, as soon as possible, and as cost efficiently as possible. The Space Launch System has successfully passed its critical design review, along with engine tests, booster tests, and structures that were flight tested last December. The Orion capsule completed its first flight test last December and is proceeding to systems testing. Orion's European service module is on track for the first flight, and launch infrastructure is on schedule. Keeping these critical programs on schedule is essential for two reasons. One, the U.S. needs to continue to maintain our global leadership in space. We must leave this legacy of leadership for the next generation. Two, schedule equals cost. Maintaining funding stability and therefore schedule is essential to minimizing the cost of these programs. NASA's leadership, plans, and management implementation reflects the need for cost efficiency with reduced inside oversight, reduced management and integration overhead, all while carefully maintaining and improving crew safety over previous systems. Budget stability is the major issue in executing these programs. All players in the appropriations process have a stake in maintaining this budget stability. This budget stability has two basic components. First, the annual debate between the executive branch request and congressional appropriations is an important factor that drives inefficiency. The second aspect of budget stability is the recent history at the national budget level of continuing resolutions and government shutdowns. Both components lead to cost and schedule impacts to the programs via continuous replanning, confusion across the entire team, and loss of team focus. NASA diligently manages risk, cost, and schedule through daily direct contractor interaction, periodic element program reviews with detailed discussions of technical and programmatic progress, issues, and risks. The joint confidence level is a model risk-based approach to assess potential technical and programmatic uncertainties and their possible sensitivities and impacts to the cost and schedule of a program. This has proven to be successful in robotic mission programs, but is much more difficult for the large, longer-term programs such as the Space Launch System and Orion. In summary, the biggest challenge in developing the Space Launch System, Orion, the launch support infrastructure, and commercial crew is budget stability, not the eventual technical issues. Managing these programs efficiently and effectively is the result of the dedicated NASA industry team across this country and the international partners. The government-funded Lewis and Clark expedition helped open the frontier for the commercial development of rail transportation and other opportunities to the West Coast. Today, NASA is opening the frontier of space and helping to build the space economy. Thank you for your time and attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Dumbacher. We appreciate your testimony. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. I presume these will be for both of you guys, if that's okay. When the administration slipped the recent Orion launch schedule, NASA was very quick to point out that they were still planning the original launch date. If NASA program managers believe that the earlier launch readiness date could be kept on track with historical congressional appropriations, then why doesn't the agency commit to those earlier dates to begin with? Mr. Cook, how about you first?
I understand what you're asking. Within the agency and within the administration, NASA plans to the President's budget request, which is the administration policy. And that's where the confusion comes in when the congressional budgets are higher. Naturally, people in these programs are wanting to progress. They are wanting to plan as much work into the funding they get, and so the appropriated budgets are utilized, and they make as much progress as they can. However, if planning in out years to the President's budget request, if they're doing that, then at some point it becomes self-fulfilling as the long lead items can't be planned on or bought or paid down, and so gradually the advanced planning overtakes what the schedule that they might have held.
Okay, and how about you, Mr. Dumbacher?
Congressman Babin, I agree with everything that Mr. Cook just said. I think it's clear from a program implementation perspective that when we try to put the best plan together that we can, and we are continuously working, in my tenure at NASA, we were continuously dealing with a plan against the President's budget request as necessary by policy within the administration, and also having to recognize that the appropriations process was probably going to change that number and increase it, that we also had to develop another set of plans to be prepared for the appropriations process. That was standard operating procedure. We did it annually because of the policy debates that were ongoing, and we did the best we could with the planning and with the execution, given that uncertainty that we were working with each year.
Okay, sir, thank you. My second question would be, if NASA reverted to the manner in which it applied termination liability to contractors under the Constellation program, as well as how it treats the ISS program and JPL, how much more money would that allow the scientists and engineers to devote to development work, and how would that impact the schedule?
In terms of the past, for instance, for the International Space Station, there were actually words in legislation that helped that situation, so that termination liability was less of a burden to programs. currently, or early actually is post-termination of Constellation program. The programs, each program had to set aside, and each project had to set aside funding to protect for termination liability. As I understand it, the number for SLS and Orion right now is on the order of $420 million. And that, if that is held back, then that's money that's not going to execution. I think there may be some relaxing of how that's done currently, but the contractors are actually, as I understand it, responsible for maintaining this termination liability. So, in any event, any help that they could have in not having to hold back funding would be beneficial, in my view.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Dumbacher.
Chairman Babin, I agree with what Mr. Cook just said. During our execution of SLS and Orion, up until I left the agency, termination liability, having to withhold that work or having to hold that money back each year meant that it was that amount of work that we were not making progress with across SLS and Orion. It was an impact to the program. It was an impact to our schedule. And it became and it was an annual issue that we had to deal with, both from a government policy implementation perspective as well as a corporate risk management strategy perspective.
Thank you. And I now recognize the gentlewoman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again to the witnesses. Mr. Dumbacher, in your prepared statement, you referred to the National Academy's Pathways to Exploration report and note that its recommendations, quote, should serve as a basis for an overall strategy and plan for human exploration. This subcommittee and the House have similar views and call for a human exploration roadmap in the House-passed 2015 NASA authorization bill. I just wonder what your views are on the key thrusts that are made by the Pathways report and whether NASA's strategy of Earth-reliant, proving ground, and Earth-independent satisfy the National Academy's recommendation. And if they don't, why not? And then what should Congress expect to see in a solid strategy? What are the key elements for a roadmap that we should be looking at that have a little bit more precision?
Congresswoman Edwards, I think the 2014 NRC report and I will be honest, I am speaking from my own, not from the fact that the chairman of that committee is now the president of my university.
That's not a conflict.
That's the way the faculty look at it. That report lays out a very sound approach. It lays out an approach and should be, in my opinion, used as a touchstone, along with the 2010 Authorization Act, to put a strategy together. I think your question about the Earth-reliant, proving ground, Earth-independent, that's the first level of it. It's not. It needs to be fleshed out in greater detail with more strategy along the way. I think it's the key elements of that strategy need to recognize that this is exploration. We will be learning each step of the way, and it has to be flexible, and we have to have the ability to modify the strategy based on what we learn. Because in essence, what we are doing with exploration is we are expanding our neighborhood from low Earth orbit out to cislunar space, and then eventually to Mars, and I hope beyond that. So I think those elements are essential to build upon the plan, and I think the NRC report gives us a good methodology by which to think about it, a good starting point, and also some good indication, frankly, from a funding perspective in terms of what kind of funding would be reasonable along with an inflation growth to be able to implement such a strategy.
So let me just ask you, Mr. Cook, then about funding, because we've heard talk already on this committee about the debates and the push and pull that have gone back and forth between Congress and the administration. But do you have some thoughts about the constraints that this uncertain environment with the sequester caps in place and basically living out level funding in what Mr. Dumbacher has described as an exploration environment, what kind of constraints that puts on our ability to fully explore and develop this program. And then lastly, I mean, I have often thought that it might make more sense for Congress to simply put a date certain, you know, an end point. NASA is saying maybe in the 2030s. Well, what if Congress came back and said, well, how about, you know, 2020? And then we develop a budget and a program around something that's more certain than just continuing to expand it into the future. And I'll leave you with the balance of my time.
I believe that the flat budget is one. Well, it's a fact that with inflation, a flat budget has less buying power over time. So to explore and move beyond where we are, move to the next steps after SLS and Orion will require increased funding. There was, at some level, not terribly high, I think, but funding does need to be restored in over time to exploration in order to make these goals. And I think it is a good question to ask if we are to get to the, say, the moon and to, by a date, to the Mars at some date. What does it take to do that? And I think that's your question. I think it's a great question. It's one that deserves an answer. That's really the way it should be done. And then, of course, you can decide, and then it gets into the debate of deciding whether or not that it can be afforded. But certainly, that's the way a program should be laid out, and in a way that has development funding that is more efficient than what's being done currently under caps and flatline budgets.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now we recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a question for both of you. How should NASA pick a human exploration mission and timeline?
I believe, and I have been able to briefly read the report that was put out yesterday by NASA. I think there are a lot of good elements in it, but I think in laying out a program, one thing that is missing from it, and one thing I've stated before, in fact, I testified on it in May of 2013 in this committee. I believe that we need to start with a discussion in the community, whether it's science or the Exploration Committee, and including our international partners, those who are interested in developing resources on the moon. We need to have a conversation up front to lay out objectives for what we will achieve on these missions. It's not just a matter of, well, we're going to build this rocket to go to this place. It's important to understand what we want to achieve, and I think laying that out helps guide the steps involved. And personally, I believe those steps include going to the moon, to going to potentially to the moons of Mars and to Mars itself.
Mr. Dumbacher, do you have anything to add?
Congressman Brooks, yes, I do. A couple of points to add to Mr. Cook is that as it's necessary to bring the stakeholders along, it's also, I think we need to be very careful recognizing the funding constraints that we operate within, that we need to make sure that the elements that we build for exploration don't just become one-offs or just be able to be used once, that they have a continuous applicability through the rest of the exploration strategy. I think that's a key element that we need to do, and we also, frankly, need to be very careful about making sure we live within the funding constraints that are and the appropriations levels that are provided by the Congress. So those are the two key elements I would add to what Mr. Cook had.
Thank you. This is again a question for both of you. And Mr. Cook, I've already heard your comments about going to the moon, Mars's moons, and perhaps Mars. But if you have any addition, please offer that. What do you recommend as NASA's SLS and Orion missions?
I believe that the SLS and Orion represent the first critical steps in any exploration activity beyond Earth orbit. You need the lift capacity of the Space Launch System. You need the volume of its payload.
I understand that, but what do you want our missions to be?
I think, personally, there's discussion about cislunar space. That is definitely a possibility. It could be a very good intermediate point in Mars, a place to send Mars missions from. But I do believe in going to the moon. The moon that we know now, based on spacecraft that have gone there since Apollo, has opened up a different moon than we've seen before, that's much more dramatic in landscapes. We've mapped resources. I think there's a lot to learn if we sent people there. So I think that the moon is still an important place to go on the way to Mars eventually.
Mr. Dumbacher, do you have anything to add?
Yes, Congressman. I think a couple of things I would add are, everything we do needs to be buildable towards Mars. It needs to help take us towards Mars and be usable along the way. We need to do the testing necessary to make sure that we learn how to operate in environments where we are further away from home than we've ever been. In the distant retrograde orbit cislunar space area, we'll be 9 days away from home as compared to 3 days away from home during Apollo. Another aspect I would add is an increase in mission frequency. I think it's important that we shorten up the time between missions. That means additional funding, but I believe it's important that we increase the mission frequency to maintain our skills, build our skills, and then be able to learn as quickly and provide the benefits back as quickly as possible.
I'm almost out of time, but this is a short question. Since Orion is running behind schedule, what can be flown on the Space Launch System in its place from a test standpoint?
Congressman, I'll take that first. That's a good question. I think the two programs have been integrally linked from the beginning in that the first flight test, EM-1, needed to have an uncrewed version of Orion, and I believe that they are on schedule for that flight. And with NASA continuing to work to the management agreement of 2021, assuming the congressional appropriations levels, they're still working to the existing plan. What other cargo missions there might be would remain to be seen, but I think we would have to have, NASA would need to take a look at possible cargo missions, other possible payloads, other possible science missions.
And I would agree that there are possibilities. I agree with what Mr. Dumbacher said, and the plan is for Orion to fly, but in the future, SLS will provide a unique capability for larger telescopes with larger apertures, potentially. There's been discussion on a Europa mission at some point. There are potentially uses in defense space as well. It has unique capabilities that could provide other very, very good opportunities.
The gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. Now I call on the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Begin, Mr. Dumbacher, you talked about budget stability. You mentioned in your testimony that the NRC report and the 2010 Authorization Act should be followed to ensure adequate funding for SLS and Orion. Could you please explain what you mean by that, and especially in light of the fact that the last time humans left low Earth orbit was 1972 with Apollo 17. What would this do to increase our confidence that the EM-2 launch will actually be carried out in 2021?
I think, Congressman, first of all, at the congressional appropriations level and NASA continuing to work towards the 2021 date for the Orion first crewed flight, I think the congressional appropriations level and accounting for inflation over this time period, recognizing the loss of purchasing power that infuses into the system, can help congressional appropriations can maintain the 2021 date. And I think that's important. For the overall exploration, I think the thoughts put together as part of the NRC report that talk about a level of funding that basically starts out similar to the congressional appropriations level, grows at about 2 to 3% per year in real growth, plus inflation on top of that, I think provides a good sound basis. And importantly, if NASA knows that that's going to be the plan over the long term, they can plan to that. And that's the important part, is if you know what you're working to over a longer horizon and you can plan to that, that is a key part. One of the things we struggled with in my time at NASA was the budget request that came out as a one-year budget request, and the budget horizon from then on was labeled as notional. As a program manager, I struggle with, how do I plan to a notional budget? So the key point is knowing what the numbers are, have some feel for what those numbers are going to be over a 5-10-year budget horizon, and then you can put a reasonable program together.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cook, Chairman Babin talked in his open statement about the administration strangling NASA with the budget cuts. I, along with many of our colleagues on both sides, offered amendments in committee to increase the NASA authorizations, only to be told that our committee hands were tied by the Budget Control Act and by the bicameral budget passed in the House and the Senate with Republican majorities. How much of these budget cuts are driven by sequester by the Budget Control Act?
I honestly can't answer that specifically on the Budget Control Acts. My experience has been primarily between congressionally passed budgets and President's budget. And I would say, as an example right now of what I think could be done if NASA were to be able to count on the congressionally approved levels, is make a decision to go to a larger upper stage than the one flown on the first test flight. We're flying an interim upper stage based on a Delta upper stage for this test flight. And if NASA could count on the congressional levels, it could probably make a decision to go to the upper stage it needs for exploration. That would keep NASA from having to human rate this interim upper stage for the first crew flight, which would save a significant amount of money. So just the efficiencies gained in a higher budget in terms of development and developing the right answer instead of interim steps would be of great benefit.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. Mr. Dumbacher, again, budget stability. We just avoided a government shutdown at the end of September. We're now looking at hitting the debt ceilings in the next couple of weeks. We've postponed the the government shutdown debate till December 11th. What was the impact on Orion and SLS when we shut down the government for 16 days in 2013? What would be the impact if we shut it down for 10 days later this year?
Well, I cannot speak to the exact details of what a potential impact would be for 10 days down the road from here, but back 2 years ago when we did have that 16-day shutdown, there was a significant impact to the program, particularly because at that point we were, particularly Orion, was coming up on the hardware and the integration a year away from the exploration flight test. And so having to stand down the team for 16 days and then restart it, when you consider the level of budgets that we're talking here and the burn rate that we had at that time, which I recall, if I do my math correctly, was on the order of $60 million a week, that's a significant impact to the program, because it's not just the 16 days. It's the planning that the team had to go through to prepare for that. It's the phasing down to get to that shutdown, and then it's the restart to come up after the shutdown. So that was a significant impact to Orion and to SLS, as well as ground systems across the board, just for a 16-day impact.
I'd like to add to that just briefly. NASA is in a unique situation on something like a shutdown. It is not like most agencies. It's developing something. It's developing hardware. There are programs that are underway. So it's a lot of people with a lot of interrelated tasks and jobs that most agencies don't deal with. So a shutdown it does have an impact in development.
Thank you. I would remind the gentleman from Virginia that in our budgeting and authorization that in issues of exploration, we fully funded. This committee always fully funded that, and that what you were referring to was not exploration of some of those issues. I now would like to recognize Mr. Rohrbacher, gentleman from California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you fellows again and again over the years. How much is the Mars initiative going to cost when it's completed? When we get the person on Mars and back, how much will we have spent?
I think at this point, since we don't have a specific roadmap with missions laid out, we really don't know the cost. I will say that if you take any program, if you take the shuttle program, if you take the space station program, and if you put the full cost at the front end of it and said this is what it was going to cost, it would be a big number. And
Okay, well, let me ask you this then. You mean there's no document that you've read that NASA, and we've all signed on to, that says this is how much is going to be spent to achieve this goal? What have we agreed to? Congress hasn't, we don't even have a budget, so we don't even know how much it's going to cost for the biggest project in NASA to achieve its goal? I mean, this is insane. How much have we already spent on the Mars project?
Well, Congressman, let me, first of all, this has been a long-term investment from the initial vision for space exploration days and going into the Constellation program. I cannot give you off the top of my head specific numbers, but I can tell you.
Wait, hold on. Do you think NASA knows? So what I'm getting here is that we don't even know how much. Well, there is no figure as to how much is going to be spent, and we don't know how much has already been spent, which means we don't know how much more will be necessary to be spent from now to achieve the goal. But we're talking about, tens of billions of dollars here. The NASA budget altogether is $17 billion. Let me just note, when we started off down this road, some of us suggested that we were going to have to drain money from every other NASA program, or it wasn't going to work, and it's not working, and it's because we don't have the money. And right now, I can, just from the testimony, you're saying we're not being responsible at this level. They're not being responsible at NASA either. We have a huge asteroid that's going to come by the Earth, or at least not right by the Earth, but closer to the Earth than usual. In the next few days. And we have no plan that if something happened, that we recognized something was coming, and that 5 years from now it was going to hit the Earth and destroy it, we don't even have in place a plan to actually deflect an asteroid yet. We've got, and let me just note, people are complaining about the budget. We're not giving NASA the money that it needs for the development of this huge rocket that's necessary for Mars. Well, if we were going to prioritize, if people really believe that having a man on the moon planting our flag, as compared to just having robots, is worth all of these billions, well, they've got to put their money where their mouth is, but nobody does that. We have, nobody's willing to prioritize. NASA spends $1 billion a year proving global warming, just to prove it. $1 billion a year. Well, maybe if someone on that side of the aisle might be willing to give up that money and put it, if they really believe in going to Mars, putting it into the big rocket that we need to take us to Mars, well, then maybe we'd have some hope that we can be successful in something, but nobody's that responsible here. By the way, of the billions of dollars our government spends, we are borrowing 20% of it from our children, who will repay the Chinese or the Japanese or whoever is buying up our debt. I mean, we aren't even responsible, and yet people are complaining. That's why we have the sequester in place, is because no one was willing to make a choice. What I'm seeing here, and again, look, my father was a pilot. My dad, and we have this great aviation technology that we put to use for humankind now. That happened because people were actually responsible. They made responsible decisions about development of technology. And Mr. Chairman, I just end my little tirade by saying that I think that we are not being responsible. I think Elon Musk will be on Mars before NASA is, and not even spending any government money as well. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, for 5 minutes.
Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Thank you for your service to the country. Thank you for your service to the future, because that's what this is about. And I just feel very fortunate that I got a place on this committee to talk about things like this. And had an astronaut in my office not long ago, a guy named Terry Virts, and my guess is both of you have worked with him, where he said, this is not rocket science, this is political science. And the part that we're dealing with right now is political science. And Mr. Rohrbacher and I, may have some differences, but generally this committee, and I've been on a lot of committees in this Congress, this committee gets along and agrees more than almost all the other ones. And so looking at this, we're the authorizing committee. So you got the Budget Committee, the Authorizing Committee, and the Appropriations Committee. I, on this committee, would like to be able to give you something that says you are authorized to get us to Mars as quickly as possible. I'd like to be able to say something in an authorizing language. 10 years from now, we're going to have our astronauts on Mars. For the future, for science, for discovery, for whatever. And so, for us, if there's a goal of something like that, then we've got to find a way to do it so that you can provide a 10-year plan. Knowing under the Constitution from year to year, no Congress can bind the next Congress. That's just the way the Constitution is. But to give you some real guidance in setting a plan over a period of time to get us there. And so for me, I just suggest to my friends on this committee, say this is a national interest, it's a huge investment. Either we raise taxes to make that investment, which, will give some people, heartache, or we say we're going to prioritize this against the whole other budget, or all the other appropriations. Or we could do a public-private partnership and get some additional investment, or we could do a joint venture with some other countries, as we've done with the space station. And I'm a Star Trek guy, and I look at the bridge of the Enterprise, and I see every nationality possible, and then, people from other planets, too. But, we can do those kinds of things, or maybe fee-based. But that's our problem. That's the political science piece of this thing. Now, the two of you have had to deal with Congress. You've had to deal with the White House. What would you suggest that we do to give you a 10-year plan? Mr. Cook?
I can tell you from experience that the authorization acts have been very beneficial to laying out our future. And the 2010 Act was very important to us. I encourage development of plans because they represent in the end, they're obviously a compromise in the end when they all get passed. And having a consensus on a direction is very important. The 2005 Act was important to us. The 2010 Act was. So those do have an impact, and we the 2010 Act actually has set the motion forward to announce in 2011 the Orion and SLS programs.
Mr. Dumbacher?
Congressman, as I stated in my testimony, I think that, as Doug has said, that the 2010 Authorization Act provides the good starting point. It laid out 3 years worth of funding levels. Recognizing the constitutional appropriations process, NASA can do a better job of planning when it has some idea of what budget level to plan to. Recognizing that cannot be passed in an appropriations perspective because of the Constitution, but having some concept of a plan so that if, for example, this body were to come back and say, use something like the 2014 NRC report as a planning basis, then NASA could go forward and use that.
So just a last question. So if we said we want to be on Mars in 2025 in an authorizing bill, could you give us a budget for that?
Then the question would go to NASA to put that plan together, and then they would need to put a budget requirement to meet that plan, and they would need to come back and show that to this body for funding purposes.
Okay, thank you very much.
The gentleman yields back. I have taken the gavel here, so I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes before we go to Mr. Posey here for the next question. What I'd like to share, I heard Mr. Beyer earlier talk about the CR and shutdowns and want to know the impact on NASA exploration, and all that's critically important. I would like to highlight the fact that under a continuing resolution, NASA exploration actually gets more funding than if we went forward with the President's budget request, and I'm not saying that because I'm advocating for a continuing resolution. I just want to make sure people understand the President's funding priorities. Now, my friend Mr. Rohrbacher earlier was talking about SLS and Orion and how much money it's going to cost, and I don't share his sentiment that maybe those programs are ill-advised. What I do believe is that if you're going to have those programs, like what Mr. Perlmutter was talking about, we need to fund them. If we're going to have these programs, we need to fund them. And it's pretty simple. So we have seen the administration repeatedly underfund the program in its fiscal requests every year. The inadequate funding requests, coupled with delays in program announcements, arguments over destinations, and the use of accounting tools such as termination liability, have caused for further delays in SLS and Orion. When I see this back and forth between Congress and the administration, I am left wondering a number of things. Since the President is not committed to this, or at least it wouldn't appear that he has been, is this political? Are we setting ourselves up for political failure? And if I could get, maybe because he wasn't committed to it from the beginning, could I get your opinion on that, both of you?
I don't think we're going toward failure. The programs, SLS and Orion, are moving forward and making great progress. It's definitely true that under these circumstances where the budgets are different and the President's budget request is less than what's appropriated, it does cause problems in programs. Decisions have to be made that are not optimum. It ends up being inefficient and costs more in the end. However, even so, you have dedicated people at NASA that make them work, and they're making great progress.
Mr. Dumbacher?
I totally agree with everything Mr. Cook just said. I have nothing fundamentally to add to that. I think I would like to reiterate that I do not believe we are working towards failure either. I think you see success out there. It's going to be hard at times because we are doing technical things that no one has done before in terms of manufacturing technology, manufacturing requirements, bringing in new technologies and taking humans further than we've ever gone before. It will be hard, but it's not failure. This dedicated team across NASA and industry is making it happen in spite of the political budget debate, and I think they should be commended for the progress that they are making to date.
And just so everybody here understands, I just want to make sure that we're going forward and actually accomplishing what we're setting out to do. And I think people on both sides of the aisle want to make sure that what we are funding is not in vain. And I think that's Mr. Rohrbacher's frustration. That's people on both sides of the aisle. And it seems to me that if we continue to hit the president's budget request, and in many cases go beyond the president's budget request, and yet we still have delay after delay, and we don't have the launch frequencies necessary maybe to maintain the safety that is perfectly appropriate for this kind of program, the question is, are we adequately funding this program? And how do we go forward in a way that is appropriate, given that this is very serious business and lives ultimately will be at stake. Last question for you guys. As we move forward for deeper and deeper space exploration, do you see an environment where commercial habitats would be used maybe as something to orbiting the moon for the long term, for example? If you guys could answer that.
I think that's potential. I encourage the commercial development. We actually in the directorate that I was managed when I was at NASA, we had the commercial cargo and crew, and those are being developed and are needed at this point. And I certainly think that's a possibility if the business case is there to support it. I think that's certainly in the realm of what could happen.
And Congressman, if I may, I would like to add to what Mr. Cook just said, in that, in my view, it's critical that we continue to perform this exploration initiative and help build commercial opportunities, because that is the future for the next generation. And it's going to be hard. We have the real life things that we have to work through in terms of business plans and commercial markets and technical issues and all of that. But this country has a long history of pushing forward and working to solve those kinds of problems, and I think we need to continue doing that, not just for our own benefit, but for the benefit of the next generations coming behind us.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Johnson from Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you for being here. Two reasons that I appreciate this hearing. I'm a big fan of space exploration. I grew up in the age of the Apollo moon race. I remember vividly sitting in front of my television so many times, listening to Walter Cronkite as he called the play-by-play, and everybody in our country was captivated by everything that was going on, because each mission we were learning something newer and newer and newer about the tasks that lay before us. And it's amazing to me to think that that we were able to accomplish that. In 1903, we flew the first airplane off the sands of Kitty Hawk, and 66 years later, Neil Armstrong stepped out on the surface of the moon. That's what we're capable of in America, and so much technology and marvels that we enjoy today came out of that effort, and so I applaud it. I'm also a program manager by trade, having spent 30-plus years in information technology. I've managed large programs. So from the perspective of a NASA program manager, gentlemen, what is the difference between a target date and a commitment date? And why might it be useful to have a target date that is earlier than the commitment date?
First of all, Congressman, the difference between a commitment date and a target date is the commitment date is the agency is legislatively held to reporting requirements on programs' progress. When I was in the agency, we purposely had to work through the commitments, recognizing that, I believe it's the Nunn-McCurdy Act, that required that we had to put a commitment there. If we were 15% over schedule or cost, then it was subject to a cancellation conversation. So the agency has to worry about that commitment, not just from a legislative perspective, but also from an integrity, trust perspective, to demonstrate it can do what it says it's going to do. The target date is the date that my team used to try to to keep the appropriate amount of schedule pressure on getting the work done as cost efficiently as possible, as technically correct as we could, and maintaining the safety. It is the art of project management in the sense that says I use the schedule to help make sure I keep driving the work forward, recognizing that I don't want to do that at the expense of poor technical decisions, poor safety decisions, but I still keep enough work going on because that way I get it done as efficiently as I can.
I liken this to an analogy of a student in college, even in high school. You handle the tough subjects first. You get those things done early in the semester. That way you're not sitting there with 2 weeks left to go before grade reports come out and you're behind. You don't want to get to that commitment date and find out that you've got that 15% overage in budget or schedule and have to face a congressional mandate to come back and worry about cancellation. So I get it. I just wanted you guys to explain. A target date is the discipline to make sure that you don't miss the commitment date.
Right. And the difference between the target date and the commitment date is the program manager's schedule margin.
Yeah, got it. How might additional funding during the period, let's talk about budget for a second. How might additional funding during the period FY 2012 and 13, how might additional funding during that period have changed the planning and management of the SLS and the Orion programs in ways other than schedule? Am I clear? Does that make any sense? How might additional funding during that period, other than schedule, how would it have affected those programs?
The additional funding at that time as well as now, I believe, helps you to get work done in parallel that you then you otherwise have to phase out if you have a limit to your funding. So you can plan things in a normal sense, things that are better integrated because you're developing them in parallel. You know the interfaces, you know how to pull them together, and if you're constrained where you can't do that, then you phase things out and you start this task, you stop that one. In some cases, we've had a test, pad abort test on Orion back in 2010. We ended up laying off people who were critical to the success of the test because the next priorities were somewhere else.
Right.
We achieved that. We still need it, but we had to make decisions so we could address the next priorities. And those things don't necessarily have to happen.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, this is a great example of how, only a program manager can know how critically important the certainty around funding to keeping a project on schedule and not winding up in that conflict with a commitment date and ultimately see everything wasted if it's canceled. Very, very important. Gentlemen, thanks for sharing your perspective this morning. I yield back.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Now I recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let's dash back to reality just for a second. Every year, NASA's requests for Orion are lower than what's needed. Do you both agree with that statement?
I would agree with that statement. There is a part of that statement, Congressman, that I'm trying to figure out how to answer you better. In that, the request is really the President's budget request.
Yeah,
and
that's NASA's request. The President's request is NASA's request, and vice versa. And it's always lower than the program needs. Congress always comes back and pays more. The question is, why doesn't NASA, the administration, request the amount of money they think they need?
Well, I think that would be a question directly to the Office of Management and Budget because it's in that budget process that the agency goes through as we build the budgets from the bottom up, from the programs, and then they get submitted and they work within the agency priorities, and then they go over to the higher national level priorities. It's in that last step where, at least from my perspective, I saw where the numbers change.
Well, the fact is, they request less year after year than they know that they need to keep the project on schedule. And it's a fact. I mean, it's not a political statement. It's not a scientific statement. It's a fact. And Congress does, in fact, always pay more. Several members were a little bit concerned about a budget, how much it will cost to go to Mars, and you know, what the total cost will be. And I think that's almost a laughable question at this point, because they don't even have a plan yet. You know, in the last several NASA authorizations, Congress has mandated that NASA come up with a detailed roadmap for Mars, a stepping stone approach to exploration, if you will. I believe many on this committee feel we've never seen a detailed plan, and I'd like for both of you to comment on what you see as essential steps in getting humans to Mars, and your thoughts on why NASA has not submitted a detailed plan to Congress as requested.
I've actually got written testimony from 2013 that addresses that specifically, that question specifically, but I'll go ahead. I believe the front end of it is laying out your objectives for what you want to achieve in your exploration program by destination. What is it we want to learn? How is it we want to prepare from one step to the next, and have a rational approach to.
I agree with you. I agree with you.
Yeah.
That's what should be done. The question is, why haven't they done it?
I can't say I can't say why, since I have left, it has not been done. Actually,
Why wasn't it done while you were there?
Well, when I was there, I left at the end of September in 2011. We had just gotten through the period after the 2010 Authorization Act, where we worked very diligently within exploration to answer that what was asked for in the Authorization Act, and we announced the SLS design and program the same month I retired. That was the first step. Our immediate concern was getting the front end of this started. We actually had a plan that we talked about that after we get the first steps on the way, we're going to come back and develop the plan. And it.
All right, I got that. I got it. Would you care to respond?
Congressman, I think I agree with what Doug said. I think part of what needs to happen is a more public discussion about some of the planning and some of the strategies that need to be implemented to go to Mars, and making sure we are all clear, that the stakeholders are all clear on what the goals and objectives are, and then allow NASA to go put a plan together.
You know, every member on this committee, bar none, both sides of the aisle, want NASA to be successful. I can give you just so many instances, though, when, at least from this perspective, they're their own worst enemy. If they can't come up with a plan, they want somebody else to do it. If it takes more funding for a plan, but you know, you have to have a plan actually before you do a budget. I mean, you can see, I hope, the negative effects of building a development schedule around a budget rather than letting the most logical schedule dictate the financial needs. And it appears that is what's happening. And Mr. Chairman, I don't know how we reel this thing in, but it's just not something that I'm proud of the way it's being done, and I see I'm over my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Posey. You know, I would also add that you were asking the question of what is the cost of going to Mars? And I would ask, what is the cost of not going to Mars? We had a meeting of some industry specialists in space the other day, and I was told that there was a Chinese program planning a permanently crewed space station for 2020, and I think everybody in this room is aware of who holds the high ground, has the great advantage. So I would say that we can't afford not to try to get organized and get this planned and funded adequately. I want to thank the witnesses for being here, both of you folks today, and thank the members for your questions. And the record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional written comments and written questions from members. So this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Every year since he took office. But there should be no misunderstanding. There is bipartisan support within Congress for SLS and the Orion crew vehicle. This committee restored the proposed cuts in our authorization bill, and the House and Senate Appropriations Committees restored these funds and supported SLS and Orion at the levels necessary to keep their development on track. Yet the administration continues to try to strangle these programs. NASA recently announced that the first crewed mission for SLS and Orion was delayed by 2 years because the administration would not allow NASA to budget for the programs. The administration regularly cuts SLS and Orion, and Congress continues to restore its cuts. The budget instability caused by the administration makes it hard for NASA to plan and execute these critical programs. The fact that NASA can still maintain these earlier dates in the face of administration opposition is a testament to the ingenuity, resolve, and professionalism of the NASA workforce. The Obama administration cannot continue to claim that it prioritizes Mars exploration if it refuses to prioritize and support the programs that will get us there. The SLS and Orion programs represent what is most impressive about the American spirit, our desire to explore. The technologies that are developed for these programs exemplify our greatest breakthroughs and demonstrate American ingenuity. The Apollo program 50 years ago demonstrated that we could reach the moon. Orion and SLS will take us beyond that and rekindle the American spirit of discovery and advance humanity farther in space than ever before. Congress will continue to ensure that these national priorities receive the funding that they need to stay on schedule and on budget. Great nations do great things, and fortune favors the bold. The next several years will determine whether American astronauts will be the first to plant a flag on Mars. We want them to have arrived there on board an Orion crew vehicle propelled by the Space Launch System. Mr. Chairman, I also just want to comment on the recent handout that we've all seen by the administration called NASA's Journey to Mars. Regrettably, however, this proposal contains no budget, it contains no schedule, no deadlines. It's just some real pretty photographs and some nice words. That is not going to do it. That is not going to get us to Mars. This sounds good, but it's actually a journey to nowhere until we have that budget and we have the schedule and we have the deadlines. And I hope the administration will change its posture and decide in the future that it's actually going to support SLS and Orion and keep them on schedule, because
and Operations Missions Directorate to serve as a witness. Unfortunately, the Associate Administrator's international travel schedule precluded his ability to appear this morning. So I hope, Mr. Chairman, that we'll give NASA the opportunity in another hearing to provide the details on the SLS and Orion programs that this subcommittee needs to hear. The fact is that ensuring that SLS and Orion make maximum progress, especially in this environment of budgetary uncertainty, is a job for both the administration and for Congress. And just as a side note, I would say that the budget caps known as the sequester give rise to the inability for us to get a multi-year bipartisan authorization and appropriation to the President's desk as the evidence of our support for SLS and Orion and for the journey to Mars. We have to lift those budget caps in order to accomplish the goals that we've set out for the agency and for its contractors. Ensuring that SLS and Orion make maximum progress, especially in this environment of budget uncertainty, is a job both for the administration and for Congress. And as the National Academy's report reminds us, achieving the goals for sending humans to deep space requires a joint commitment on the part of Congress and on the part of the administration. Mars is truly a goal that's worthy of this great nation, and I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, to enable NASA's continued progress toward that goal. And before I yield, I want to welcome an intern for a month in my office, Salil Maddy, who is at the Madeira School. We share interns with them every year, and two of them here today are very interested in space, and so we welcome them. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. I now recognize the chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At a fundamental level, space exploration, the mission of NASA, is about inspiration. This inspiration fuels our desire to push the boundaries of what is possible and to reach beyond our own planet. The American people are fascinated with space exploration. Just last week, the discovery that water sometimes flows on Mars' surface made headlines across the world. And the latest space film, The Martian, has sparked questions about when NASA will send astronauts to Mars. Today's hearing seeks to answer those questions and examine the effect of the President's budget on our exploration programs. In its fiscal year 2016 budget proposal, the Obama administration proposed a cut of over $440 million from the programs that will take us to Mars, the Space Launch System and Orion crew vehicle. This isn't new. The President has tried to cut SLS and Orion every
Subcommittee on Space will come to order, please. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Deep Space Exploration, Examining the Impact of the President's Budget. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Last week was an amazing time for the space community. A major Hollywood film about the exploration of Mars debuted within days of NASA announcing a significant scientific discovery, liquid water on Mars. The coincidence of these two events garnered the public's attention, and rightly so. Rarely does popular culture and science align in such a serendipitous fashion. The attention also prompted obvious questions from the public, such as, how will discovering water on Mars impact future exploration? Are we really going to Mars? And how and when are we going to get there? These are all questions that the general public may not have the answers to, but thankfully, NASA does. Because of bipartisan direction and investments made by Congress, we are well on our way to Mars. We're building the most powerful rocket ever built, the Space Launch System, so we can launch large payloads to beyond Earth orbit with decreased risk to overall missions. We're building the Orion crew capsule so that our astronauts can travel farther into deep space than ever before. And we're upgrading our ground systems to support 21st century operations. NASA has already tested the RS-25 engines and 5 segment boosters that will power the SLS. They've already launched an uncrewed version of Orion. And the Kennedy Space Center is undergoing revolutionary upgrades. But there is much more that needs to be done if the United States plans on launching a mission to Mars. We need to build a habitat module, advanced in-space propulsion, and a lander and ascent vehicle, just to name a few components. Fortunately, we don't have to develop all these capabilities at once. We can develop them incrementally over time. There are also potential opportunities for international and commercial partnerships that could be leveraged as well. The first step on the journey to Mars, however, begins with the development of SLS, Orion, and the related ground systems. Unfortunately, Congress's support has not been matched by the administration. In 2010, the President signed the NASA Authorization Act of 2010 into law, thereby directing NASA to develop the SLS and Orion systems. This piece of legislation was the product of a democratically controlled House and Senate that passed with 185 Democrats and 119 Republicans, demonstrating overwhelming bipartisanship. These programs are critical for the journey to Mars, and yet since 2010, the administration has attempted to cut their funding each and every year. This year alone, the President's budget request contains a cut of $343.5 million for SLS and a cut of $104 million for Orion. All told, the President's budget has requested nearly $500 million in cuts to these programs this fiscal year. This committee's NASA Authorization Act for 2016 and 2017 fully rejects these proposed cuts. And both the House and Senate Appropriations Committees have approved bills to do the same. Even though Congress consistently rejects the administration's proposed cuts year after year, the proposed cuts still have a negative effect on the programs. The annual budget uncertainty that the administration perpetuates impairs NASA's ability to manage the program efficiently on behalf of the taxpayer. At the same time that the administration has been strangling these programs, the NASA workforce has been diligently trying to keep the programs moving by setting up alternative cost and schedule commitments called management agreements. The agreements are separate from the official commitments in the KDP-C. While it is promising that NASA is trying to make the best out of a poor situation, having multiple plans could potentially lead to confusion and inefficiencies. Fortunately, SLS and Orion have been successful in spite of the external challenges placed on the programs. This is largely thanks to the supremely professional workforce at NASA and the contractors. To all the hardworking men and women who are advancing the development of these programs, please know that your hard work is very much appreciated. Your work on these programs will inspire the next generation of explorers, maintain U.S. leadership globally, and chart new courses for humanity. Thank you for all that you do. You are the best that this nation has to offer. My hope is that folks across the administration will reverse course and begin to support the SLS and Orion programs and the workforce that makes them possible with the funding necessary to continue their success. SLS and Orion are crucial for deep space exploration and the first steps to Mars. We have two steely-eyed missile men before us today who are directly involved in the management of the human exploration program while they were at NASA. I look forward to hearing about how we can all ensure the success of our nation's human exploration program. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentlewoman from Maryland, for an opening statement.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to welcome back our two witnesses, Mr. Dumbacher and Mr. Cook, today. And I say back because both of you have appeared before our subcommittee previously as former leaders of NASA's human exploration programs. I appreciate your past public service as well as your willingness to testify here today. Mr. Chairman, last December, millions of people in America and around the world tasted the future when NASA conducted the Exploration Flight Test, EFT-1, in which the Orion crew vehicle traveled farther into space than any human spaceflight vehicle since the Apollo era. That future is an exciting one that includes sending humans to the surface of Mars. And Mars is the goal that we established in our bipartisan House-passed, overwhelmingly House-passed NASA Authorization Act of 2015. We sent it over to the Senate. And it's the consensus goal for human space exploration of a distinguished National Academies panel that recently examined U.S. human space exploration. So it's quite fitting, Mr. Chairman, that we follow up on our subcommittee's review of the Space Launch System and Orion crew vehicle programs that was held last December, just after the FT-1 flight test, and see where these programs stand now. By any measure, the progress on SLS and Orion is visible and tangible. NASA and its contractors deserve credit for the many accomplishments achieved to date. Tests of the SLS solid rocket booster engines and the RS-25 main engine are reviving and modernizing the propulsion activities that brought us through the successful shuttle era. Elements of the Orion crew vehicle that will return American astronauts to deep space are being fabricated even as I speak. And just a few weeks ago, the Orion program was approved to transition from formulation into development, a major milestone known as Key Decision Point C, or KDPC. This hearing should provide an opportunity to discuss the outcomes of the Orion KDPC review and clarify any questions, including the perception by some of a 2-year, quote, slip to the first crewed flight test known as Exploration Mission 2, or EM2. However, I would note that the members of the panel were actually not involved in the recent Orion KDPC review. Only NASA can address questions regarding the KDPC, I can't even say that, KDPC milestone, discuss the breadth of accomplishments achieved to date, and inform us of the challenges going forward. Only NASA can do that. That's why, Mr. Chairman, I'm actually quite puzzled that NASA was not initially invited to testify, and why I extended an invitation to the Associate Administrator of NASA's Human Exploration